Today I'll be talking about the process of photosynthesis. The general equation for photosynthesis is six carbon, six carbon dioxide mixed with six waters to produce glucose and oxygen as a byproduct. There are two steps of photosynthesis. There is there's a light reaction step which occurs at the thylakoid membrane, and this is where solar energy mixes with water to produce chemical energy. And the chemical energy is ATP plus NADPH. Also, water is produced as a byproduct. The second step of photosynthesis is Calvin cycle, and this occurs in the stroma. And this is also referred to as the light independent reaction, or the dark stage, because it is not dependent on light. This is where the carbon dioxide mixes with the chemical energy produced from the light reaction stage, ATP or NADPH, to produce glucose to sugar. In this video, I'm only going to be talking about the light and the light dependent stage. So the first step is you have light hitting the pigment molecules within the thylakoid. So light is a form of electromagnetic energy, also called electromagnetic radiation. It travels in waves, and when white light hits a substance, three things can happen. The light can be absorbed, where no colors are seen and molecules absorb the energy, or light can be transmitted through a substance, or the light can be reflected or bounces off an object. So pigments are substances that absorb visible light, and not all pigments will absorb the same wavelength colors of light. What dictates what colors a molecule can absorb is that pigments can only absorb a particular wavelength of light. It's the amount of energy. The amount of energy must be equal to the amount of energy required to excite the electrons from the ground state to the excited states. So when the electrons are excited within the pigments, it could pass down the energy, and and as they pass down the energy, the electrons will go down to ground state. So in this process, the first step is the light hits photosystem 2, which is also referred to as photosystem 720. So as the pigments get excited, the electrons within the pigments get excited upon the light coming in, and as electrons get excited, the energy will be passed down to nearby pigment molecules, and this passing down will continue happening until the energy is an appropriate wavelength to be absorbed by the reaction center. Once the reaction center absorbs the energy, it passes this down to the PQ molecule within the membrane. Meanwhile, because it loses electrons, it is reduced, and now it needs to be oxidized and become neutral. So this is where H2O comes in and releases its and it donates its hydrogens here to calm it back down or bring it to its neutral state. Meanwhile, this is where oxygen is produced as a byproduct. Once electrons are here, it is passed down to the cytochrome. The cytochrome is capable of creating a proton gradient, meaning it passes it allows for the active transport of the hydrogen protons. It passes hydrogens from the stroma down to the thylakoid space. This active movement refers to the protons going against its concentration gradient from low concentration to high concentration. This accumulation of protons in the thylakoid space is a source of energy, and it is potential energy later used to fuel the conversion of ADP to ATP. Meanwhile, the electrons and the energy is passed down to the PO molecule, which is within the membrane. Later, you have the light hitting the PS1 or the photosystem 680, and then the same thing that happened here happens here. The electrons are excited, the energy are passed down to the nearby pigment molecules, and the pigment molecules will proceed being passed down until it is an appropriate wavelength to be absorbed by the reaction center. As it's absorbed by the reaction center, it is passed down to the FD molecule. As the electrons are passed down to the FD molecule, because it loses electrons, it has a positive charge now and needs to be reduced. The PO molecule reduces this photosystem and brings it down to a neutral state. Finally, the electrons from the FD goes to the NADP plus reductase. Once the NADP plus reductase gets the energy required, it is able to fuel the conversion of NADP plus to NADPH, and it does it by mixing NADP plus with the proton. So this produces NADPH that later goes on to the Calvin cycle. Meanwhile, you have the ATP synthase that uses this large proton gradient that is formed in the thylakoid space. And because this is a form of potential energy, it is used by the ATP synthase to make ATP. It makes the ATP by adding phosphate inorganic to an ADP. And as it produces ATP, the ATP goes on to the Calvin cycle and it plays a role in the Calvin cycle. That concludes my video. Thank you.